Greetings, intrepid listeners. Adorable, cuddly, humble, and fierce September 6er Paul Toscano generously agreed to team up with me to bring you a bumper Christmas hamper of brain food. On each of the 12 days of Christmas, Mormonism's little helpers will deliver to you a conversation about one of the big ideas or controversies in the theology of Mormonism. In my opinion, you are never stupid to have found the big ideas in this religion interesting, inspiring, and a launching point or guide by the side as you consider for yourself what on earth is the meaning and purpose of life, the universe, and everything. Is there a God? What kind of a person is a God? What does that God want from us or for us? Does Christianity or Mormonism have anything useful to say about this, or is it all a big distraction? Are their doctrines mind expanding or thought stopping? Since we can't get intellectually and spiritually fed on their starvation rations, we have to look elsewhere to have these conversations. And wonderfully, there have always been heroes like Paul Toscano willing to keep up the fight for making Mormonism much more interesting again, or Mamma Mia for short. Undaunted by betrayals, persecution, excommunication, and skepticism, he has fought the good fight, published the books, perambulated the podcasts, and kept fanning the flickering flame of hope that the better ideas in Joseph Smith's theology could make Christianity healthier and more rational, and that the Mormon religion could still stop ignoring or breaking the treasures it has inherited. It was a very rare privilege to chew on some of these big ideas with Paul and hear about some of his first-hand interactions and experiences trying to persuade the prophets and apostles of LDS Mormonism to raise their game. As always, Mormon civil war is not just about robust and valid critical analysis of why the church we love is spiraling down a plug hole towards oblivion, but also offering pathways out of that early grave. In these conversations, we grapple with the most fundamental concepts that would have to be resolved of all regarding things like the 5 or 6 different versions of the Godhead that LDS Mormonism has been running with, and what Jesus' atonement and grisly death was actually accomplishing. Brace yourselves. It's Christmas. I'm going to sing. On the 8th day of Christmas, Paul Toscano said to me, Chapel priesthoods, Joseph Smith, good or evil, mystics, prophets, and managers, scriptures as visionary text, revelation, insight to theophany, imagination versus fantasy, idealism versus physicalism, and Mormonism versus Christianity. All right. So welcome back, everyone. Our topic today is going to be chapel priesthoods. Now, in a way, we should understand before we begin that this is in tension with our next episode, which will be temple priesthoods. And my assumption is chapel priesthood is going to be all about patriarchy and power, and temple priesthood much more kind of inclusive and mystical. But let's see how it goes. So what do you mean by chapel priesthoods?
Chapel priesthoods is a term I picked up somewhere that is not my own. It's just that so long ago that I can't remember who said it. So whoever said it,
thank you.
Kudos to you, but I just can't remember. And what I mean by chapel priesthoods, and I think what was meant by the person who coined the term, was the priesthood that allegedly was restored by Peter, James, and John the Baptist, and that we get by the laying on of hands from another priesthood bearer who got it from another priesthood bearer, got it from somebody who was ordained by the 3 witnesses or Joseph Smith. And it's patriarchal. It's for males only. It was only held by adults in the early church. Later in the early 20th century, the Aaronic priesthood was designated for boys, where deacons and teachers and priests were boys of ascending ages like we have now. I think a
Can
deacon
I
is.
just pause on that one? Because that is so weird, isn't it? These days, maybe we're getting an insight into why that might have happened, because today they keep making everything younger and younger because they basically want to lock in brainwashing the young people before they leave. They're aware that by age 25, 80% of the young people raised in the church leave. Rumors are now, and we certainly see it anecdotally locally, that it could be as many as 60% of missionaries who return are gone pretty quickly thereafter. So
Mm-hmm.
they're just desperate to lock in the young, a bit like the Jesuit Catholic idea that, give me a child until they're 5 or whatever, and I'll give you them for life. They'll leave for a bit in young adulthood, but they'll always come back because we've brainwashed them. So we're now ordaining 11-year-olds and all of this stuff, and everyone's going on missions at 18 and things. And we're trying to get them into the temple a lot more when that used to be an adult activity. So could it have been that in the early 20th century, they sort of realized in some way they needed to lock in the young men into priesthood duties at a younger age? Maybe they just realized teenagers are hard work and they want to try and civilize them early, which I certainly think works. It's only helped for me and my peers. I saw, having some basic responsibilities where you serve food to other people rather than expecting everyone to feed you as a young teenage male is a revolutionary life change. And
Well, I
sometimes
don't
it
know
needs to be
whether
that basic.
I wouldn't necessarily. I did not think it's
Yeah.
possible. What you say is possible,
Yeah,
just
I've
locking
I've
them
never heard
in.
it
But
discussed.
I
Yeah.
think it was simply because they didn't have any training for the young men before they were
Mm,
elders going on
okay.
missions, and so I
Mm,
think somebody came up with one of the first presidents, maybe George Buchanan or
mm,
Widsoe or somebody came up with the idea that maybe we should designate
mm,
the Aaronic priesthood for boys, and they came up with this idea of 12 to 14 for deacons and 14 to
mm,
16 for teachers and 16 on until
mm,
18 or 19 before they become elders. But there was another idea that I think you need to know, and I don't know whether you know this, but the endowment ceremony is divided into Aaronic and Melchizedek. There's two
mm,
parts to the Aaronic and two parts to the Melchizedek. And Brigham Young once stated somewhere that he thought that the young people 12 or 13 or 14 should go to the temple and receive the Aaronic order, the first and second tokens in their
okay.
association, and then
Mm,
come back to get the Melchizedek portion later when they
mm,
were older. And so
mm,
I don't think it was something that just came out of the blue in the early 20th century. I think there had been thinking along the lines of, we have
mm,
Christ did not come in 1890, and now
mm.
we are stuck here possibly for the long term. We've got children to raise. We didn't do such a great
That's a
job
good
in the
point.
late 19th
Yeah.
century.
Mm,
Now there's also the fact that by the beginning of the 20th century, even though there were labor laws, you had child labor laws to
mm,
prevent that. And you begin to have
mm,
this concept of childhood, which
mm,
didn't really exist in the same way in the 19th century,
mm,
especially
mm,
for males. I mean, you get out and work,
mm, mm.
and or you go to university and you come back and you work, right? And
Mm,
so
yeah.
I don't know whether it was just to lock them
Mm,
in the sense that
mm.
we maybe they do now because they're
Yeah.
afraid.
Yeah. So I can see it more. That would sort of suit the mindset in the church back then. It's more about training and preparation for
Yeah.
responsibility and a growing global church. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah.
So there
Intriguing.
is that, and that there is the fact that you block out the women. Now, a
Mm,
thing that happened, which Margaret has written about
mm,
eloquently in a number of different places. There's
yeah.
her response in there was a book that came out by Newell Bringhurst and those others who I think Matt Harris. Margaret has an essay in there about um, how the church leaders they they changed the language of Joseph Smith's speeches to the Relief Society, where he says, "I will turn the key to you and
Mm,
make of this society a kingdom of priestesses or kingdom of priests," reported a little differently by different women. But
mm,
those early discourses made it clear that in his mind he was going to make women priests on an equal footing with men. And in the endowment
mm,
ceremony, it does that because the
mm,
endowment doesn't, I mean, the women are sitting on one side of the room and the men on the other, but the same language. It's not like they let the women leave the room while they're giving the men the
Mm.
priesthood. The
Yeah.
women are standing there
Oh,
dressed
well,
the same
they
way.
wear the robes of the priesthood,
Exactly.
absolutely. They're participating in Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood ordinances in the
Well, the
endowment.
women
Yeah.
who were endowed in the
Mm,
Nauvoo believed they held the fullness of the priesthood on an equal footing with the
mm,
apostles and with the other men. We'll get to that when we talk about the temple priesthood.
sure.
The first presidency changed the language of the speech that Joseph Smith gave. He said, I turn the keys to you. They changed
Mm,
it, I turn the key in your behalf. And there was a
mm.
big fight that went on for about 10 years between the Relief Society presidency and the first presidency about the language. And when
Oh,
they came to
interesting.
some anniversary,
Mm,
they, uh, the president of the Relief Society, I forget who it was, maybe Bathsheba Smith or somebody, back in the early 20th century, said, was insisting on the language that he said he would turn the key to us, not on our behalf. That wasn't what he
yeah.
said. And the first
Mm,
president said, no, 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 you can't say that. And so there's, I mean, my wife has written an article somewhere, and I should know by heart where it appeared, but it talks about this problem
mm.
and how they fought it out. And she actually has a picture of the Relief Society magazine's cover in which Joseph Smith is standing there turning the key to the Relief Society and
Ah,
in a piece of art. So even
mm,
though it was not stated that way in their memorial of their anniversary, they managed to
mm.
sneak it in onto
Okay,
the
this
cover.
is
So that because
excellent.
they were, and remember that it was in my lifetime as a member of the church when Belle Spafford
Mm,
was the president of the Relief Society. It was a lifetime appointment,
mm,
and they had, she was, they had their own bazaar, their own money, and their own
mhm,
magazine,
mhm.
their own way of
Well,
raising money.
this is
It was,
something, my mum was adamant about. She secretly subscribed to Exponent, to the feminist newspaper, which was very unusual. She was very kosher. She served in lots of leadership roles as primary and Relief Society ward and stake leadership on a loop, and later public affairs for the church, and became a counsellor. But all the way through, one of her major themes was feminist, empowering women in the church, helping them to understand their power. And she had a visceral hatred of the correlation that had taken away that autonomy and independence from the women. And she taught that to me. So part of my podcasting fire is a tribute to my mum, and that was there from quite young. I was made aware of that from having these conversations with her, which seemed very transgressive at the time. It's like, oh my gosh, my mum's a secret rebel. Ah, this is so cool.
well,
Um,
It was Harold B.
mhm,
Lee who shut down the Relief Society, his autonomy,
mm,
based on his correlation program. And it was
yeah.
his successor, Spencer W. Kimball, who got rid of the office of the patriarch of the church, all for the
Mm,
same reason, because they
yeah.
couldn't control the patriarch and
Mm,
they couldn't control the Relief Society because they had their own money
mm,
and their own magazine.
mm,
And the Relief Society presidency would travel around on their own money, talking to women without the men present. And
mm,
this was very threatening to the first presidency. Harold B. Lee's idea of correlation was really a consolidation of all the departments of the church, which were kind of back then. And when I joined the church in 1963, the church was a loose confederation of warring tribes. And after
mm,
Harold B. Lee correlated it, it's now under the thumb of the first presidency. And
mm,
so it was a really big change. But earlier than that, another change happened. And this happened early on. And I frankly don't know when this happened. But when the priesthood was first revealed in the early 1830s, uh, you didn't have to, you were ordained to an office of the priesthood. The Aaronic priesthood was conferred upon you. And then you were ordained to an office within the Aaronic priesthood that gave you your duties, because the duties were associated with the office. The authority was associated with just the conferral. So we confer upon you the Aaronic priesthood, and now we're giving you the duties of a
mm.
deacon, or the duties of a
Yeah.
teacher, or the duties of a priest. So your duties were defined by the office. And if they changed duties, they would change your office to something else. You become a teacher instead of a deacon, or become a priest instead of a.
Yeah.
But what happened was that if they made you a bishop, you were a bishop. But later on, you became the bishop of a ward. And let's suppose you were released from that position. You were a member of the ward, former bishop, and then another bishop became bishop, and then he was released and he became a former bishop in the same ward, and now you have the third bishop. Well, the first two bishops have no authority as bishops. They can't give anybody permission to baptize anyone. They can't interview anyone. They have no authority to elevate somebody to being an elder, or they can't ordain anyone without the permission of the
Key
bishop of the
holder,
ward.
as we call it now. Yeah.
Yeah. And what happened there is that even though you are ordained to an office of the priesthood, your authority depends upon your position in the corporate church. So you might be a high priest, but you have no real authority to function as a high priest unless you're the stake president.
Yeah.
And so that all of the priesthood power then is shifted over to the corporate offices of the ecclesiastical structure. So you can be an apostle, and that was true of Alvin R. Dyer, who was an apostle, and Henry D. Moyle was an apostle, but they weren't in the Quorum of the 12. And as soon as the president died, the Quorum of the 12 didn't recognize their authority. They couldn't say anything. They couldn't speak in church, because you have to be within the corporate structure. So when I talk about the chapel priesthoods, the emphasis is on chapel, because you can't function in your priesthood unless you also have a position within the ecclesiastical structure. So regardless about the revelations about priesthood and in the Doctrine and Covenants, people who have the chapel priesthoods, who have the priesthood by the laying on of hands, cannot function unless they also are a stake president or a mission president or a branch president or a ward bishop or a quorum president. And even those are all under the control of a mission president or stake president. And they're under the control of the Quorum of the 12. Everybody is, and the first presidency. And so really, priesthood doesn't have any meaning apart from the corporate ecclesiastical structure. And that's just something that people don't concentrate on much. But theologically, they've eviscerated, because they don't want people going around feeling autonomous. They want people to feel like they are under the thumb of an intercessory priesthood, that you can't have a direct relationship with Jesus Christ or the Godhead or anybody except it come through this intercessory priesthood. So if you get a revelation, you go tell your bishop you've gotten it. He'll say, it's not a real revelation unless I tell you that it is, because there's an intercessory priesthood. And that is different from the temple priesthood, which was intended not to be intercessory. It was intended so that it acted apart from the ecclesiastical structure. And so we can get into that, but that is why I think that it's important that we contemplate theologically how the church has its corporatization has basically eviscerated this whole concept of priesthood. Whatever it was is not that now.
So in effect, you described a management system, and maybe it's appropriate to again touch base with Hugh Nibley's talk, Leaders and Managers. He's saying the managers, in effect, are drones. They're not going to innovate. They're not going to be that responsive to revelation. Their priorities become status quo and corporatism and control, and doing what you're told by your line managers, and hoping to aspire to become the line manager yourself one day, or this sort of capitalist business model. And that kills the spirit, the legalism, the Phariseeism, the rules and regulations, and enforcing them. And we've talked earlier about how the church kind of needs lots of different types of people in order to function. Some of them need to be the boring managers to keep the lights on and organize everything. Other people need to be the great fiery preachers, and so on. It's quite rare to find someone who has all of those skills. And Paul talked about this with his analogy of the body and everyone else having quite individual spiritual gifts or parts to play, but you can't do without the other. So where you have a sense of this system kind of losing something, what would it actually look like in your view to, I mean, would we do away with all these callings, or to have, in a sense, the priesthood roles, bishop, elders, quorum president, deacons, quorum president, and if you ordain women, they're all in the same room in the same quorums, or they might have a female equivalent, Relief Society president, whatever, whether you separate them or mush it all together. What would it actually look like, in your view, to do chapel priesthood properly? Is it an entirely different mystical thing? Because you always have this tension between the organized church and the idea of patriarchal priesthood, where families are autonomous and parents are the priesthood leaders of their children and their tribe, which comes into Mormon rhetoric at times, and certainly used to a lot more than it does now in my experience growing up in the church. And the idea that somehow temple priesthood maybe is more patriarchal, it's more about family. And we've also touched before on this kind of, again, maybe it's in a kind of another version of it, that contradictory ideas of the Godhead, that you have corporate Godhead of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and or / Michael, or maybe Michael's the other one. But then you have the Godhead of Heavenly Father, Heavenly Mother, maybe Jesus as the Son, or however you want to construct it. But there always seems to be these two versions of everything: chapel priesthood, temple priesthood, corporate Godhead, family, female inclusive Godhead, family based, not church based. What would you suggest, if you've ever thought about this, it would actually look, what would be different about doing chapel priesthood like priesthood should be? If we
Well,
both
this goes
accept
back.
it needs management, you need a chapel priesthood, but it's clearly not working. It's a dead, thoughtless, they'll organize a potluck and some ministering, but the church is dying with the chapel priesthood as it is. So what would need to change? Sorry, go on. I'll stop asking the question and let you answer it.
Well, you can keep asking me the question if you want. I'm not sure I have a very good answer anyway, so I'm happy to have the chance to think about it.
Fill some time.
But I think, first of all, there is like I say, there's the cross and the shadow of the cross. There's the gospel, and then there's the gospel that's transactional, or a quid pro quo gospel. There's the God of love and the God of obedience, the God of forgiveness and the God who's waiting to punish you, give you impossible tasks to do, and then blame you for doing them poorly or not at all. So I think that this gets us into the second part of this, which is really could be a different episode, or we're going to have to just elide into it. And that is the temple priesthood.
And so we conclude this episode on a dramatic cliffhanger. To hear Paul's full and fascinating answer about how the temple endowment can liberate ourselves and our church from oppressive corporate patriarchy into the freedom of a priesthood of autonomy and gender equality, tune in to our next bumper episode of Mormon Brain Food. It's a new year, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints desperately needs new ways to do pretty much everything if it is to survive or thrive. The amazing news is that the way to make that happen has been there waiting to be noticed in its own doctrines and rituals all along. See you tomorrow.